Bernat Claramont Lopez. He's a friend, first of all. He's a researcher, a colleague from CREAF, Ecological and Forestry Applications Research Centers, and professor of ecology at the Department of Plant Biology, Animal Biology and Ecology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Today and for the next 2 days, he will stay with us in order to share his knowledge and his experience on climate change, the effect of climate change on mountain ecosystems and biodiversity. It's really a great pleasure, and I thank Bernard to be here and to share your knowledge with us, and the floor is yours. Okay. If you can
maybe this one, or maybe this one better.
What?
So, good afternoon. Well, I mean, it's me that I have to thank the team of Unimon for letting me come here, because this is the only university in Europe focused on mountains. And for the ones that are working in mountains, this is a privilege to be able to see it and see how it works, and how the students that are, I know that some of you are from here and some of you are from Milan, maybe, or some people that are connected from Milan. But for me, it was like a dream, something that I had to do, coming here and to see this university in the middle of the mountains. Because what I teach is in the middle of the city, in Barcelona, a big city, which is not exactly the same. So, well, can you hear me, or? Ah, yeah, because I move a lot. All right, I promise I'm not going to sing. So yeah, I am Bernat Claramunt, and I've been working in the mountain things for several years. And so today what I'm going to do is talking a little bit about the mountains and the effects of climate change on biodiversity, mostly on biodiversity. And I'm not going to inundate you with hundreds of examples, because I think it's nonsense. And because I'm just going to say some general things, and then I will focus on 2 things that we are doing, 2 projects that we have been working for the last times, as an example of how we study this and how we get the results, right? So I've prepared this as if it was not like an important presentation of a huge congress, but a class at my university. So please feel free, and actually I ask you to interrupt me and ask questions, because if I have to be speaking 1 hour or 1 hour and a half, it's going to be very tiring for everybody. So the more interruptions, the better. Okay, so feel free to ask. If you want to ask in Italian, go. I speak Catalan, so I may understand you a little bit. I will not answer in Italian for sure, but you can, and we have translators here, so if you don't want to ask things in English, just use Italian. That's fine for me. So something that maybe for the ones that are studying here, it's obvious. Oops, wait, let me see. All right. Something that we normally, when we study mountains and we apply for projects in mountains, we have to describe. So we have to define a mountain. And probably, actually, if I asked you, which is what defines mountains, some of you would use some of these characteristics to define mountains, right? And actually, they are the characteristics that are normally used to describe a mountain, but you have to know that in Italy, the description of a mountain in Italy is not the same as the description of mountain in France. And even, for example, within France, depending on when you are, the characteristics of a given territory are different for a mountain, right? So it's not clear, it's not exactly clear what a mountain is, and this sometimes is a problem when we apply for research projects, because we have to agree with the reviewers about the concept of mountain, right? In some cases, there's an European description of mountains, which is mostly topographic, about the slopes and nothing more, slopes and topography. But in other places, they use like percentage of agriculture or rural area. Also local perception, because maybe for what's a mountain for you may not be the same of what's a mountain for somebody living in Nepal, for example, in the Himalayas. And so this is also important, what the local perception of people about what the mountain is, right? So probably if I asked you which of these 4 pictures are mountains, I think that we would all agree that that one on the top is a mountain, right? If you don't agree, you can leave the class because this is the Everest, so it's the highest mountain in the world. But maybe for the rest, we would not agree that much. I mean, is this a mountain? Who thinks that this is a mountain? Just raise your hands. Just one person think that this is a mountain? No, 3 persons. Okay, well, so for the European description, all these are mountains, right? And probably for the people that live here, these are mountains. And the highlands, for example, in Scotland, which look more or less like this, they are mountains. And they are an important mountain range in Europe, actually, right? And so, so that's just to show you that it's not that easy. We normally think, each of you have a different perception of what the mountain is or description of what the mountain is. And this for science that we have to describe everything, to have clear definitions of things. Sometimes this is a problem, sometimes, not always, right? That said, there are lots of mountains in the world, right? If you just look at this, just for this, only for this, not for any of the rest of the things I may say in a moment about why it's important to study mountains, etc. Only because of they occupy a big percentage of the land. That's important, or that may be interesting to study this kind of landscapes. Okay, but why a part of this percentage of territory in the world is it important to study mountains? So I would say that there are 3 main characteristics. One is what we call the climate compression, right? So this probably you all know, maybe you didn't know that it had this name, but it's this characteristic of the compression or the fact that when you go up in the mountains, there's a change in the environmental conditions that it's the same as if you walked to the North Pole, but we don't have to move that much, right? So here you have a plot, a figure that shows this the latitude. So from the tropic to the Arctic, and you would see that this is the altitude, so it's hundreds of kilometers, and this is the thousands of meters. And this shows which is the relationship between these 2. We have another one, then I will share this presentation with all of you, so don't worry, I mean, I can send it to you, well, I'll give it to them and they may send it to you. But this is more or less the same. So just look at this. So here it says that a given tropical mountain, if it exists like this, so in Mexico, could have all the climatic zones of the whole Northern Hemisphere, for example. Just within 6,000 meters, we could go in terms of the environmental variables, the climatic conditions, we could move as if we moved until the North Pole. So this is what we call the climatic compression. And this is very interesting for us because to see differences, the differences that depend on the climate, differences, for example, in biodiversity or different biodiversity variables, we don't have to move that much. It's easier to see a difference between within 100 meters than within 100 kilometers, right? So only for this, that's interesting in terms of changing environmental conditions, not only climate change. Mountains were also interesting before climate change, but just because you have a variety of an heterogeneity of environments within short distances. This is one thing. There's another thing that you all know for sure. That's the topography. Here you have an example of a mountain that's facing the sea, and you all know that the north-facing slopes are very different in terms of the vegetation, which is a consequence of the climatic conditions. It's very different from the southern slopes, right? In this case, you would have like, because there's the sea here, so you would have quite high humidity, whereas here it would be drier. So again, within short distances, we have different environments, even without climate change, right? So we have topography. So in terms of moving upwards, you have a variety and heterogeneity of environments. And then moving, let's say, around the mountain, you also have another dimension, let's say, of environmental change. The third one is rugosity. Here you have a figure of mountains. I think it's in the States. But I wanted to put this because it shows the different, what we call the rugosity within a slope, right? So at another, let's say, spatial resolution, we have many different environments within shorter distances. And here, a good example of this is this paper that wrote a very important scientist that has been working in mountains for many, many years ago, Christian Korner. And he wrote a paper about how to measure temperature. And it was like 90 ways to describe plant temperature. And a part of this, which is very interesting, I think this is interesting because within a meadow, that meadow here, they measured the temperature at different areas. And you see that you have like 26 degrees here, and here you have 14 degrees, maybe, let's say, 1 meter apart, right? And so this rugosity in the landscape is very interesting because, which is very characteristic of mountains, of course, not only mountains, but also in mountains. It's very interesting because now mountains, especially for some species, are described as climate refugees. Because imagine that you are a beetle, that you are adapted to live at, I don't know, at 26 degrees. With global warming, maybe this goes from 14 to 26. So you as a beetle, you will only need to move like 1 meter to escape climate change, right? And for some species, of course, for some species, mountains and this rugosity can be climate change refugees. But also, and more importantly, we have this third dimension of change of environmental conditions. We have the elevation, we have the topography, and then we have the rugosity. And this creates a plethora, thousands of different microenvironments that to study which are the effects of changing environmental conditions is great because we don't have to move that much. We have to move, but we don't have to move that much if we have a good description of the landscape in terms of these environmental conditions. Then within a mountain or two mountains, or not having too much, we have different, let's say, environmental conditions in terms of temperature, humidity, slope, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to study the effects of climate change, mountains are a perfect place to do so, right? Of course, we could do the same moving from the tropics to the North Pole, but it would take more money. And you know that, well, maybe you don't know, but now I will tell you, money is a problem for research because we don't have money. And of time, because if we had to move to the North Poles, it would take longer than if you just have to hike a mountain, right? So, that's what makes mountains especially interesting to study the effects of climate change, because of course, these changing climatic conditions are happening at all these environmental or spatial scales, right? So these are the three main characteristics of, let's say, abiotic characteristics of mountains that make mountains especially interesting for that. But more than that, the ones who study mountains, we realize that mountains are a system, right? And it's not only a place where there's animals and plants that live more or less happily without the effects of human presence, etc. And now we normally use a word that it's quite common, which is more than a system, it's a social-ecological system, right? And here I've put, and I'm going to talk about this at the end of my seminar today. Here you have a scheme that was proposed by a Nobel Prize in economy. She's a woman, she's Elinor Ostrom, that presented this framework, which is very interesting because it's based, or it's focused on the sustainable development or use of resources, right? And we can apply it in mountains or anywhere else, but also in mountains. And then I'm going to show, and at the end of my talk today, I'm going to show you an example of how we have used this. But basically, what I've just, biodiversity would be one of the things, resource systems, resources, but now in this Anthropocene area that we are now. Of course, you may study plants and animals, but you have climate change, which in this framework, it's something that you cannot see here, but this is like, just the environmental variables, it's okay. I mean, just, it's the truth, there's two main drivers. No, don't worry, Anna, it's okay, it's okay. It's just like environmental conditions, climate, etc. But the system, basically, it's resource units and resource systems. A unit can be, let's say, a tree, and a system could be a forest, and that depends on your focus. But of course, within these systems, you also have users, and in mountains, users are very important, the different actors. Now they are called actors. So this was the first. Now, in newer versions there, we call them actors. But then you have governance systems, because it's not the governance within a region can make things, the governance system of a region can make things very different. Of course, you cannot do the same actions here than in Africa or in the Himalayas. So when we study mountains as a system, it's good to be aware that there's people using resources, there's a governance system, let's say local rules, what is protected, what is not, what you can do, what you cannot do. And then all this interacts within two drivers. One is the climatic, environmental variables, which is climate. And that's the social, economic, and political settings, which is like the global framework, socio-ecological, the social and economical status of this area, right? Because it's not, we cannot do the same in terms of management of biodiversity here than in Africa, because all the social and economical global status of the country is different than here, right? So it's good to keep this in mind, even if we are only studying biodiversity, right? Because now I'm going to explain a couple of things, and then I'm going to show some examples about biodiversity only, and then I will go back to this, okay? All right, so probably you know this as well. This is one of the classification of ecosystem services, and this is interesting and important when we have this in mind, the previous scheme that I was showing you before about the actors, how the actors use or interact with the resources. And here, well, we have all the ecosystem services, the provisioning, regulating, and probably the ones who have been reading or studying a little bit about mountains, you know that mountains provide all the ecosystem services with different extents, but all of them, or almost all of them, are provided by mountain systems. Well, that's so let's start talking about climate change. Probably you have seen, well, this is not the animation goes year by year, but basically it just shows that the climate change is happening, and you see that it's not only in mountain systems that which is here and here in the Alps. Here you are quite red. This is the anomaly. So it's the reddish is the higher the temperature respect an average. So here, so you may see that there's lots of mountains actually, even at this scale. that are quite red, like of course here the Alps, but also the Himalayas, also the Rocky Mountains, not that much my mountains, which are the Pyrenees, but also the Pyrenees. But even at this, and also a little bit here, the Atlas Mountains, you see that they are quite red. Because mountains in general are more affected by climate change than the lowlands that surround them. Probably because of this topography and climatic compression, right? That make things happen in shorter distances, and then there's synergies between the different environmental variables. So that's the global view of climate change in the world, but of course then we have to go to a lower territorial scale, and here I'm just showing the example of the Pyrenees. This is let's say a downscaling of the climate change models. This was part of the third Catalan report of climate change, where the meteorological service divided Catalonia in 3 regions: the Pyrenees, the interior areas, and the coast. And here you'll see in a moment that what's predicted for the Pyrenees, which is the mountain territory, this is rural. So let's just focus in the Pyrenees. And you have here the 4 seasons. In the Alps, it's probably the same. And if it's not the same, we also, let me open a parenthesis, we think that what's happening now in the Pyrenees is what's going to happen to you in 10 years or so because of the latitude change, but probably whatever happens to us will happen to you in some years in terms of environment, climate, etc. Because, for example, we know in Barcelona, well, no, in Montpellier, if you localize Montpellier and Barcelona, in Montpellier, now they have the climatic conditions that we had in Barcelona like 20 years ago. So it's more or less like this. So it's going to come someday. Well, whatever. So here you see the increase of temperature and precipitation. You see that globally, temperature is going to increase in the next years 1 degree, which is a lot. And precipitation, which is much more difficult to predict, is going to decrease in all seasons except winter, right? Globally, precipitation is going to decrease a little bit. In winter, maybe we have more snow, right? Maybe, but this precipitation can be in the form of snow and in the form of water. And the differences and the consequences of having a snow or water in winter are huge, because snow is like a stocking water for the following seasons. And if it's rain, it goes just down, right? So, but well, what we see is that in general, we will have like higher temperature and lower precipitation. And what does it mean, basically, in terms of desertification? Well, that's very extreme, eh? Desertification. I would say drought. We will be a desert, maybe some in 50 years or so, but not yet, not yet. Still, you can come and there's trees in Catalonia and stuff. But yeah, so this is drought, and nobody likes this, right? Drought, I don't know here in the Alps, but in the Pyrenees, we have a risk of forest fires in the mountains that this did not exist 30 years ago. We had fires in the mountains, but they were small. And now we have had really quite important forest fires in the mountains. That's just because of this. And fighting against forest fires in the mountains is extremely more challenging than in the lowlands because of the topography, et cetera, et cetera. And fire spreads much faster in the mountains than in the lowlands. So, so it's very bad. And drought basically is related, of course, to water. And I'm gonna explain you a couple of things about this related to the mountains. Wait. So mountains have been always described as the water towers, right? Because they are the water towers of Europe and of the lowlands, because they store a proportion of water that is not proportional to the land they occupy. right? So, and if we have drought, then we'll have less water. And less water means that we'll have less water for the agriculture, less water for the plants and animals, less water for energy producing, less water for forests, less water for the people, less water for the industry, navigation. In the case of rivers that big rivers that you can navigate. In Europe, there are some, and it has implications for tourism. So we know that climate change is going to affect a lot the water regime, and this will have effect on this, which basically these are some of the ecosystems. Water, of course, is an ecosystem service, and the service is related to all these things. And so it's going to affect the biodiversity for sure, right? With implications, then we can talk about this on management for sure. And then another characteristic of mountains is that mountains are also described as biodiversity hotspots, right? Why do you think that mountains are biodiversity hotspots? Why do you think that mountains have a lot of biodiversity? Exactly. Exactly. I mean, one of the basic ecological explanation of highest richness is heterogeneity. It's a mechanism. It's one of the mechanisms of having higher biodiversity is higher heterogeneity. The more habitats, the more richness. Right? That's clear. And so, since we have this huge heterogeneity of habitats, we have higher heterogeneity, we have lots of species. Right? Here you see that most of them are mountains, and you have like, this is how they are classified hotspot one. And this is more or less the same, that's a species richness in different parts of the world, and you'll see that most of them, not all of them, of course, are in mountain systems. And similarly for endemics. Mountains have a lot of endemics because, and we don't have time to talk about this, but islands have a higher percentage of endemics than the continents because of many different ecological explanations. And mountains, in a way, are islands, right? An island is I don't know, Earth in the middle of the sea, but also a lake is an island because it's different than the metrics surrounding it, and a mountain is an island. So when we talk about island theory, there's a huge ecological theory about island biogeography, et cetera, et cetera. Mountains are islands, and mountains and islands in general have a higher proportion of endemic species for evolutionary explanations. And mountains are, in this way, mountains are different than the surrounding areas, and so that's why we have more endemics. So, no, I think here there's nothing. This is an example of this paper. Well, when I send you you have here down there, you have the bibliography where I've taken all this. But you see that here on the top, you have the proportion of land area in the world of mountains. Mountains, you see that it's like 25% of the global territory, which is not much. I mean, I said it was a lot, and that's a lot, but it's only 25%, right? But you see that the proportion of species, these are vertebrate species that live mostly in mountains, is not proportional to this 25%, right? So it's just another way of telling that mountains are important because they host lots of species and with a higher proportion than the other places. And of course, it's important if you want to preserve biodiversity. If biodiversity is not important for you, then it's not important, right? But normally we say that biodiversity is good. But there's a lot here also that I'm not going to discuss now here, but mountains now have a high biodiversity. But because mountains have been, maybe I go off topic a little bit now, but you let me go a little bit off topic. But this biodiversity is due to the fragmentation caused by human presence in mountains, right? You know that one of the problems of mountains that I'm not going to speak is about abandonment. People just abandon the small towns and they concentrate either in big cities or in the cities that are in the valleys, right? But we lose these farms that were in the middle of the mountains that were cutting some trees. They had their meadows. This is disappearing in many places of the world. What these small settlements caused was a fragmentation of the habitat. And a fragmentation of the habitat means habitat heterogeneity. And so we are losing many species of insects and birds in mountains because their habitat is disappearing. Where there was a meadow, now it's a forest. Where there was a dry stone wall, because there was a path or whatever, now there's a forest. And so all these species that were adapted to these meadows or to these dry stone walls are disappearing. We have more forest species, but less species. We have higher abundances of the forest species because forests are taking all over again. And now we have less, we have a lower biodiversity, but it's natural. So the balance here is very difficult for, I mean, imagine that you have to decide whether you want a higher biodiversity, which is due to anthropic presence, or lower biodiversity, but more natural, right? So what would you decide? I mean, I don't have an answer here, but it's not easy. It's not easy because the high biodiversity, our reference now is the reference we have from what we know from the past, and it's a higher biodiversity than now, but it's provoked by humans, right? Now we are tending in mountains to a high homogenization of the landscape, more forest and less fragmentation. And this means less habitats, this means less heterogeneity, which means lower biodiversity. It's like this, but natural. So it was before, so what's better? Do you want to preserve biodiversity? You want the highest possible biodiversity or not? Well, yeah, well, yeah, no, yeah. Okay, so which are the responses of the communities, the natural communities to global warming, to land use change, et cetera, et cetera? It's all this, right? We have migrations, we have losses, we have higher or lower diversity, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of species. There's many different responses of the plants and animals because there's a lot of diversity of environments. And what happens in the Pyrenees is not what happens in the Alps, is not what happens in the Rocky Mountains, is not what happens in the Himalayas, et cetera, right? But there are some common things. And one of the common things is that species like humans, you have the human climatic migrations, all the people that live, we have all these problems, right? That people migrate from north to the south. Here in Italy, you know well, but also in the States, they know well. The people from Mexico, and they just go upwards, and people from Africa come to Europe. And one of the reasons is climate, because it's a place where you cannot live, right? So species do the same. I mean, if you are in a place and environmental conditions change, climatic conditions change, if you can, you move to where you have better conditions. And in terms of mountains, this means going up, right? Because if where you are it's warmer, then you go up if you can. So one of the responses of species is moving upwards, right? The other one, which is the other one? Sorry. Of adaptation, yeah. But adaptation is, well, now it's, so moving upwards is a kind of adaptation, right? I mean, you just move to a place where you were not before, right? Another, huh? Now in English? No, it's translate. Yeah, well, unless the resource moves up as well. But that's a problem, and we're going to speak about this on Thursday, right? This mismatch is about the trophic relations or the dependencies between species. But yeah, so you move, all the species move the best they can, but of course, some species are faster than others. This is what we call flexibility or behavioral flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. The other let's say, general response is a change in what we call the phenology, right? The periods of the life history, the life cycles, etc. So if it's, what we see is that, for example, flowers are blooming a bit earlier, or insects are appearing a bit earlier, or birds that come from Africa come earlier, and they live late, etc., etc. So it's another kind of adaptation, and also in the mountains, not only in the mountains, but also in the mountains, which can create these mismatches that we talk about this on Thursday. Well, so here I have three examples, I think, 2 or 3 examples where research groups have already measured these changes in the elevational distribution, right? Here you have one that was done in the Bale, I think it was in the Bale Mountains in Ethiopia, here. And what researchers did, they used 2 approaches. One of them were doing lots of plots to see the distribution of there's more, I don't know how many species, well, all these species. And then they also have data from the bibliography. What they did was measuring the distribution, the elevational distribution of these species, of all these species. So this, for example, these species can be found between 3,500 and 2,000 something, right? So it's where you can find each of these species in terms of elevation gradient. So this is the current height of the plateau. And here they modeled climate change scenarios, which means that at the 2 degrees, at the plateau, it would be here, and at 3 degrees here, et cetera, et cetera. So they've seen that with an increase of 4 degrees, all these species that are in red wouldn't have place, because there would not be a mountain there, because mountains are like cones. So at the end, you don't find a territory. So the optimum of these species would be above the plateau. So it wouldn't have a place to grow. So these species, and this I think it's the 90% of their distribution range, would just got extinct. They are going to be extinct because, at least in these mountains, they won't have a place to establish, right? For the others, that's fine. These ones, instead of being, so for example, this one, instead of being at 500 meters of the plateau, they would be at the plateau, but they would still have place to establish. If everything, if things don't change much, right? Because we have all this, maybe there's an herbivore that was not there and now it's there, that eats them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But only related to climate, these species may go extinct, and these species will be at the highest possible elevation. Another one with another taxonomic group, this is in the Appalachians, and they were using lichens, which are also very good to study the effects of climate change and pollution. And basically what they found is that with different scenarios, some of the lichens would just disappear in the future. And here you have the habitats that are likely to be used for these lichens. And basically what you see that in 2070, most of the areas that are good for lichens now would be bad for lichens, also due to climate change. And finally, here you have another example of a study made in China, in the Huangdao Mountains, I think. One is written somewhere. Well, Hengduan Mountains, where you see the direction of change of all the species. It goes from the valley to the top. This is just a summary of this, but you see that all the species go higher. So basically, it's not something that maybe 10 or 20 years ago, people, if you look at the literature, they said, well, it's possible that this happens. Now we know that this is happening. And plants that they don't have the capacity of moving very fast already move, and we see this. And this is not an invention, this is not a model, this is data, right? With animals, we see the same, except that maybe it's a bit more difficult to study animals. We will talk about this tomorrow because they move a lot, but also the capacity of moving. And for some species, we have already seen that they there are some changes in their distribution range for animals. The animals that don't have that much capacity of moving. If you are I don't know, if you are a deer, you can walk like kilometers, and it's much more difficult to see these changes in the distribution. But for plants, it's quite easy. Okay, this is another work that was very interesting. This is in the Andes, and I'm not going to go through this because it would take too much time. But basically, what we see is that it's also a literature revision, and they saw that, and in the mountains, in the Andes, and they made a revision of many papers published so far. And for these stressors, you have temperature, climate change in general, lower precipitation, which is something that we've just seen that is going to happen, glacier reduction, etc. What's going to increase or no, or what's not going to change. And this is a summary of the table. There's a huge table in this paper where you can see the different effects on different taxonomic groups, etc., etc. But basically, you see that there's an increase in extinctions for some species, or population densities due to a lower precipitation. Also, there's no change, for example, in some cases of extinction rates due to climate change. There's a huge variety of things, but you see quite a lot of extinctions here, and of course, altitudinal shifts, which is what we know that's happening. Changes in altitudinal distribution, changes in abundance. In animals, we see more changes in abundances than changes in presence absence, for example, due to climate change. But basically, you see that there's a lot of changes in things. So animals are adapting as much as they can to the new conditions, animals and plants. This table is for animals. They studied animals and plants, okay? So now I'm gonna talk about what we do in the Pyrenees. So this is a project I've been running for now 6 years, and it's gonna run for maybe until I retire, if possible. It's a project that's aimed to study, it's funded by this American NGO, which is the Earthwatch Institute, that basically what they do is they recruit volunteers of all around the world that came for 9 days and help us do the field work. And so this is that was a group called Jason, but we have like 100 volunteers every year coming to help us do our things. So what do you think that this is? What is this? The globe? No. Huh? No. Well, this is a disaster, but apart of that, this is the food web of the vertebrate species of the Pyrenees, only vertebrates. This we built. All these are 200 vertebrate species that currently live in the Pyrenees, and all these are trophic interactions. So this species eats this species. This species, well, let me check. This species eats, this species eats this species, etc. So this is who eats who, right? And we're going to talk about this on Thursday, but it's just to show that that my interest is not only on one species, but for the whole community, and the whole community only for vertebrates. There are no plants and there are no insects here. If we added plants and insects, it would be like, well, if this is difficult, then it would be impossible, right? But again, I mean, we cannot study all these. I would like to study all these species at the same time during the same period, but it's impossible, right? Here you have all the vertebrates. So when we thought on how to understand which are the effects of climate change on the mountain natural communities, on these, and of course we know that it's impossible to study all these. So we went more, we simplified it a lot, right? So this is our, let's say, framework, our small, not food web, because there's not, here there are trophic interactions and not trophic interactions, but basically what we are doing is studying the different components. We have black pine, which is the species that lives at the higher elevations there. We have insects. We study passerine birds, small mammals, large mammals, and the soil. Also the Scots pine, which is the one that's probably going to replace black pine at the high elevations in the future. And then, of course, we have these drivers of change, which is the land use and the climate. Right? This is a long-term project. I mean, we've been running this for now 6 years. And so we are going there, of course, every year. And every year we go in spring, in summer, and in autumn to see the changes in the phenology. So comparing years, we can see that this, let's say, patterns of change of all these components and their relationships. And if we go there seasonally, we see changes in the phenology of each of these components. Maybe we see that, I don't know, passerine birds start breeding earlier because temperatures are getting hotter, et cetera, right? So I'm going to explain you a little bit the results we have so far and how do we study these components. Oh, sorry. If I can. Okay, so this is our design. We have 12 high elevation sites, and then 4, which are not marked here, 4 low elevation sites. All these sites are at 2,000 meters above sea level, more or less, at the tree line. And in each of the sites, we study all these components that I had in the previous slide. Why do you think that we are in the tree line? Why do you think that we decided to put most of our sites in the tree line? Well, the tree line is what we call an ecotone. And ecotons are very interesting in ecology because imagine that, let's see where we see the tree line very clearly. Here, inside 07, right? We have the forest and we have meadows. This is the tree line. It's clearly the tree line. If we did it here, we would only see forest species. Here we have meadow species. Here we have everything. So in the ecotones, we have higher biodiversity because we have species that live in the meadows and species that live in the forest. Also, for the forest species, do you think that this habitat is better than this one or worse? If you are a bird that lives in the forest, where would you prefer to live, here or here? In the forest, right? I mean, if you are a forest species, you prefer the forest. If you are a forest species, if there are some species that are also adapted to these ecotones, right? But the optimal habitat for a forest species is the forest, not forest and meadow, right? And the optimal habitat for a species that lives in the meadow is the meadow, not meadow with trees. For example, we've been studying marmots for 8 years, and they prefer the meadows. But the optimal habitat for the marmots is the meadows. And when there are no territories in the meadows and marmots have to find a place to establish, if there's no place here, they go to a suboptimal habitat, which is here. So the ecotone is higher in biodiversity because we have species that are, let's say, adapted, are good for these two habitats, species that are adapted to these ecotones. But what's more important in terms of studying biodiversity is that this ecotone is a suboptimal habitat for the forest species, and this is a suboptimal habitat for meadow species. And if it's a suboptimal habitat, it has consequences on the fitness and probably on the abundance, right? Because the habitat is worse than the best one, so there will be fewer resources, and so the abundance or whatever, but let's say the abundance will be lower. And this is good to see changes because it's easier to see a change within 10 species or 10 individuals than a change within 1 million individuals. It's easier to track the changes in ecotones, right? So that's why we chose to work in ecotones, because we want to see changes in, right? Abundance or fitness or whatever, right? Let's go to the different things we are studying. So one of the things that we are doing is studying the organic matter decomposition, and this probably, maybe you know this. This is the way organic matter is decomposed, and this is the way. I mean, when leaves fall from the tree, for example, they follow this curve, this pattern. Here we can. There's two variables that are important. One is the decomposition rate, which is the shape of this curve. This curve, yeah. So if it's like this, decomposition rate is faster, it's higher, and if it goes like this, decomposition rate will be slower. So that's the loss of weight per unit of time of decomposition, right? And then another important variable is the stabilization factor, which is the proportion of organic matter potentially decomposable, that it's not decomposed, that it's still retained in the soil, right? So which do you think that is the effect of temperature on decomposition rate? The higher the temperature, the higher the decomposition, or the lower? Higher, right? So what we were expecting was that decomposition rate would be higher with higher temperatures. And with the stabilization factor, higher or lower? Lower? Yeah, we had no idea, actually, but we also thought that it would be lower, because if the decomposition rate is faster, we would thought that maybe there would be less organic matter retained in the soil. That is what we thought, okay? So let's see. So what we are doing, we are using a standard methodology used in citizen science, which is called the TBAC index, because normally when you want to calculate decomposition rate, you need at least 3 measurements. You need initial weight, last weight, and something in the middle. You need at least 3 measurements to build this. So, right? So, with this methodology that it was created by, it was established, let's say, by a university in, I think, in Finland. What you do basically is you use 2 species of, you use green tea and rooibos tea of Lipton, and a special, you have to use these ones because it's how the protocol is prepared. But you bury them, you bury the 2 tea bags at 10 centimeters, you weigh them in advance, and green tea is very light. It has, most of it is sugars. And the rooibos tea, if you are tea drinkers, you know that rooibos tea is very woody. It has lots of tannins, right? And there's almost no sugars in the rooibos tea. So you weigh them in advance, you bury them, you wait 3 months, more or less 3 months, and then you take them. And then you weigh them again. And so with the differences of weight between the 2 species, you can calculate, there's a formula, and you use this formula to calculate this, because in 90 days, the green tea has lost everything. So it's just the proportion of organic matter that the proportion of the green tea that remains is basically a stabilization factor. And then they use the rooibos to calculate this, right? So they change like time by species somehow. And it works very well. So what we have found is that the stabilization factor has, this is data for 4 years. So we found that only in 4 years, and this was quite surprising because we thought that it would take longer, the stabilization factor is lower, right? So that means, what does it mean? So this is what we expected, and that's what you hypothesized actually. So remember that this is the portion of the organic matter that stays in the soil. So it's lower and lower. And this is the different years, right? And this is, you don't see it, but this is for the spring period, spring, summer. And this is for spring, summer, autumn, right? Because we bury tea bags in different things and we also fertilize them. I'm not going to show it, but what we've seen is that both in spring, spring, summer, and summer, autumn, there's a decrease in the stabilization factor, which means basically that it's more carbon released to the atmosphere. So what we know that's happening in the Arctic with all the permafrost decomposition and the release of CO2 to the atmosphere due to this increase of temperature, it's also happening in the mountains, right? We have not seen much change in the decomposition rate, right? So it's not here, but the decomposition rate is more or less the same, a bit higher, but not much. But what we know is that, so with the same decomposition rate, and probably because the season is longer and longer due to climate change, there's less carbon stocked in the soil, right? So basically it means that carbon is released at the same speed, but longer. So there's less carbon that is stocked in the soil, which means basically it goes to the atmosphere. And this is part of these positive feedbacks that the higher the temperature, the higher carbon to the atmosphere, carbon released to the atmosphere, the higher carbon released to the atmosphere, the higher temperature, et cetera, et cetera. So it's part of these positive feedbacks. So with black pine, we do two things. One is this. One is we measure the growth, the increase in growth, right? Basically, we use two approaches. These are called dendrometers. There's this one, which is very simple and very cheap, which it's like a metal band that has two scales. And every time you go, you just measure where the two scales match. And you know the difference in size divided by the number of days. And you know how much they have grown. This tree has grown between two periods of time. This one costs like 20 euros. It's very cheap. This one, it's the digital ones. This one costs like 250 euros. It's much more expensive. But this has a higher resolution. It measures the change in width every half an hour and make an average of every hour. And it's so sensitive that it can track, let's say, feel changes at the scale of microns, right? So we know that when trees start to do the photosynthesis, it's when they start to move the water and the sap from the roots to the leaves, and then they lose water. So since water starts to move in the vessels, they get a bit thinner, because during the night that they have not done the respiration, the water is like in the vessels like this. So the vessels are a bit thicker. When they start moving, there's like a depression in the vessels, so the trees get a bit thinner, just a little bit thinner in the morning when water starts moving. So we know what time each day in the morning trees has started doing the photosynthesis. Trees have started doing photosynthesis, and then there's also a temperature sensor here. And for example, we have some of these dendrometers installed since 2016. So we have like, for the ones that have worked, which is most of them, we have 30 of them. We have 200 of them, and because they are cheap, and only 30 of them because they are expensive. But for some of them, we have data of every hour for the last 6 years, right? Of every day, every hour, 7 days a week, et cetera, et cetera. Well, some of them have been absolutely destroyed by horses and cows, but we have replaced them, right? So, so we have here a database of hundreds of thousands of rows. Every hour we have the growth and the temperature, growth increment or decrement and temperature. So in general, what we have seen. So we have seen that trees at high elevation do better, a little bit better, but statistically so significantly different than the trees at the low elevation growth. And this is not from the digital, this is from the normal ones. And this was a bit surprising because as I told you, I mean, if you are a forest species, your optimal habitat is the forest, not the high elevation, which for us, the high elevation is the tree line. These are the trees that we have in the tree line, and these are the trees that we have in the middle of the forest, which should be the optimum place for them. And we were expecting that now growth would be higher in the forest than in the tree line. And we were expecting that over time, with climate change, temperatures would be in the optimal range for these species, right? But we have, so this is the data aggregated for the last 4 years, let's say. We've seen that trees at the higher elevations are doing better. So, nonsense. So what we wanted to do is try to explain this, right? So which factors, and we had to figure out which were the factors that could affect these, let's say, unexpected results. What do you think that we should study? What should we put in our statistical analysis to explain this growth, this difference in growth between the trees at high and low elevations? Temperature, for example, no? High elevation temperature is different. Huh? What else? Huh? Precipitation. Soil type or soil texture, soil characteristics, yes. The sun? Sunlight, radiation, yeah. Yeah, why not? But I mean, so all these are possible, but then you have to, but it's within a mountain. So most of these things do not change much. I mean, oxygen at 1700 and 2000 something is the same. Radiation is more or less the same. Precipitation, we don't know because it's very difficult to measure precipitation at this detail. Temperatures, we have temperatures. You can put temperature. We also have the precipitation. What else? The soil, we measured the soil. The soil was similar. The wind, yeah. The pressure, yeah, but that's not much different. You're forgetting one of the most important factors. Yeah, so you go, that's the direction. So, so individuals of a given species, for sure, they compete with what? No, with other species, we don't know. Maybe they compete, maybe not. But for sure, they compete with same species. They have exactly the same requirements, right? Maybe they compete with another species, with a shrub, but maybe the roots are different. Maybe the way they use the water, the way they intercept the light is different, or etc. But for sure, two individuals of the same species have exactly the same requirements. This is what we call interspecific competition, right? Then there might be interspecific competition. Luckily for us, these forests are mostly monospecific. So we only had to measure interspecific competition, right? Competition is difficult to measure. And there's many ways on doing it in the lab, but in the forest, competition between trees, well, among trees, it's quite difficult, right? So we used an index that takes into account within 5 meters from the tree that we are measuring the growth. Within 5 meters, how many trees they have, at how close they are, and how big they are, right? So the index basically, so the closer, the higher the competition, and the bigger, the higher the competition, right? Makes sense. So it's a very, let's say, simple index, but it's one of the only ones that we can use without doing lab experiments with trees that are 100 years old. It's impossible, right? So, so we calculated the competition index of all of these 200 trees, and we saw that. So we saw that the growth, basal area increment, this is the way we measure growth, the increment of basal area in square millimeters a day, decreases with the higher the competition, which makes sense actually, right? So the higher the competition, the lower the growth, right? And then what we said, okay, which is the higher effect competition or elevation, which means temperature. We played with temperature, we played with elevation. And what do you think that plays a higher role now, so far? Competition or elevation? Explaining this difference of growth of the trees. Well, it's competition, okay? Basically what happens is that probably if we had done this like 20 years ago, we wouldn't have these results. At the tree line, temperatures are worse for these trees, for these species. But now, since we know that temperatures have already increased, trees that are at the tree line don't have, or have fewer trees around. So now that temperatures are good enough for them, and they don't have individuals of the same species that disturb them, they can grow like the tropics, right? We expect that in some years it will change. The trees at the low elevation, they will struggle. Probably they will be outcompeted by trees that come from lower areas. And maybe the trees that are now at the tree line will already have trees around of the same species, and they will start competing quite a lot. But now there's a competitive release for these trees that are living at the high elevation, right? And what we have done now is, so now we know that these trees grow better, but we don't know what's happening with establishment. So is recruitment going better at these elevations? So the establishment of the trees, right? And what we have done now, and I cannot show the results because we don't have results yet, but we planted around 4,000 trees at the at 2 elevations, seedlings. We planted seedlings like this, and we will see how they manage, how the success of the 2 species of Scotch pine and black pine at the 2 elevations. We planted these 4,000 trees, and now we will see how they go. With the COVID, we haven't been able to go to the field, so we don't know. But we will be able to compare the response of the adult trees with the response of the seedlings, right? Okay, with the birds. So with the birds, we do lots of things. We have around 200 nest boxes, and then we also put mist nets and capture the birds, okay? And then we also study the insects, try to measure the insects, so the resources that they have available. So I'm just gonna give you a couple of examples of what we have from the birds. This is the number of nest boxes occupied in these 4 years. I don't have the data of the last 2 years, sorry. But we've seen that it's increasing, and this makes sense because this is when we installed the nest boxes, so it takes some time for the birds to discover the nest boxes and decide to use them. But anyway, this is interesting because there's a peak here in 2018, right? And just remember this. So, well, this is these are the different species. And here you have different species and different sites, but it's more or less the same, right? We are mostly focused on these 2 species because this is the crested tit and the cold tit, because they are species that are present in all the elevational gradient. So we can see if we can really see if they go. Our hypothesis is that the nest boxes at the high elevations, which are not now quite occupied, will be occupied more and more because of the better conditions that there will be at the high elevations. This is the hypothesis. But this is a hypothesis for the long-term pattern. But of course, within the long-term pattern, there's like high frequency variations. And now just remember this 2018 for the nest box occupation, okay? What we also do, so every time, I don't know if you are, or you know, people that capture the birds and bring them. So we capture the birds, and then we measure them, and we bring them, and then we release them. And we take lots of measurements. There's a standard methodology, and we measure them. And one of the things that we do, well, within these measures, is to assess the fat content of these trees. You blow the stomach of the birds, and you see, and from the color, you can assess the quantity of fat that they have, which is, it's a scale from 0 to 5. And actually, there's another one that is higher resolution that we are starting to use now. But basically, for the cold teeth, which is quite small, we have seen that the fat content of at the high elevation is higher than at the low elevation, which makes sense, right? Because conditions are colder, and so they are supposed to store more fat. And this is probably the proxy we're going to use to see changes in the morphology of the trees. We expect that over time, they will not need to store that much fat to survive the winter, right? And finally, with the birds, we ring the birds because we want to study their demography, their changes in the population, right? And there's, let's say, there's different methodologies to know how many birds you have. If you want to see demographic changes, so how the population changes, you have several options. One of them, of course, is counting all the birds. But of course, we cannot count all the birds that are in the Pyrenees. It's impossible. It's possible sometimes. For example, when we were studying the population of marmots, we knew in our region, in our mountain, let's say, exactly how many marmots we had. So we had around 100 marmots. So we could really know and measure real changes in population, right? But normally you cannot, I mean, you want to know how many birds you have in the Pyrenees. So how do you do that? So we use the recapture methodology, which I don't know, maybe you know it or not, but I'm just going to explain the very basics of this one. So imagine that this is what we want to know. N is the number of birds that we have, and this is the number we want to know, right? So we capture some birds in the first event. This event can be 1 day or can be 1 month, that depends, but now it's not important. So we capture, let's say, 15 birds, the first event, okay? Then we wait and we release them, of course, and these 15 birds are mixed within the population. Then we go and we capture again some birds. And we capture 17. But out of the 17, 4 are already recaptures of the first one, right? So here we have two proportions. The proportion of, what's happening here? I don't know why this is gray, but that's okay. So the proportion, this proportion, capture 1 in relation to this, and recaptures in relation to this. So a subpopulation in relation to the population, and a subpopulation in relation to this given population, right? If nothing changes, and this is very important, if nothing changes between these two events, these proportions have to be the same, right? It's a subsample within a sample and a subsample within a sample. If nothing changes, what do I mean by if nothing changes? For example, if the probability of capturing individuals between these two events, if this is a spring and this is summer, there's a huge change in environmental conditions. Maybe because in a spring, females are in the nests, so I cannot capture females. Or here, because there's lots of chicks that are crazy and they fly around and I can capture a lot and they move in families. So this wouldn't be useful here because if conditions don't change, right? But if conditions don't change, then we have these probabilities that are the same. And so I have all these. I have capture 1, capture 2, and recaptures. So I just have to isolate, let's say, N. And actually, I wanted to count how many green circles I had here, but it should be around 60 some, right? Of course, this is the basic of the capture-recapture method. But of course, this if is never true because there's the probabilities of capture males is different than females, even within weeks, or chicks, etc., etc. So the more data we have here, we can put, or we can just change these numbers or modulate them with the probability of capturing females, probability of capturing males in summer, probability, we can just put the probability of capturing the different groups, and this lets us calculate this population, right? And this is the basic of, so people bird birds and tag species to use this. This gets extremely complicated. There's people that are specialized only on this, and this is evolving a lot. I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but it's super complicated. The models are very, very complicated and quite better than maybe 10 years ago. But that's what we do. I mean, so we capture the birds, 1 day, assess or know, or be able to describe the change of the population of these 2 bird species. With the small mammals, we do the same. We use a standard methodology, and we just capture them, tag them, and release them. And it's much more difficult to capture small mammals, especially in the Pyrenees, because there are not that many. Also birds. I mean, we don't capture that. We capture around 100 birds a year, and with small mammals, it changes a lot. And we have these species, so we have all these species that we capture. And look at this, because this is the number of individuals captured within a year. And you see that 2018, we have a really low capture success. And what was happening with the birds in 2018, we had the highest number of birds occupying the nest boxes. We don't know whether this is a coincidence or it's something that we call ecological redundancy, because in terms of their role in the community, both small mammals and passerine birds are the prey of the same species, or some species of medium-sized carnivores. They eat, some medium-sized carnivores eat small mammals, and they also prey on these birds, on some of these birds. So we don't know whether this is it could be a coincidence, or maybe in the following years we see that when there's lots of birds, there's no small mammals. When there's lots of small mammals, there's no birds, or this kind of stuff, right? But that basically now it's quite interesting. And it's what we are trying to describe, actually. I didn't say so, but we are measuring all these things at the same time and want to see if, not only for a given taxonomic group, the patterns of change, but the relation of the different patterns of change of the different taxonomic groups over the years, right? For the large mammals, so what we use is camera traps. We have, in these 12 sites, we have 60 camera traps. We have them deployed in groups of 5. This is called a station, and each station have 5 camera traps just to increase the possibility of capturing or taking pictures of the species that just cross the camera, so move in front of the camera. And we install them in May, and then we take them out in November, because in winter it's all covered by snow, so it would make no sense to have them installed. So what kind of data? You know how, well, camera trap, do you know how camera traps work? Basically, you put the camera traps, they have 2 sensors. They have an infrared sensor and a movement sensor. And when something moves in front of the camera, depending on the threshold that you have set in the camera trap, if the difference between the infrared signal of what moves and the matrix is higher than the threshold, it takes pictures or videos, basically. So it just takes pictures of everything that moves in front of the camera, right? So we have this kind of data with the camera traps. Imagine that we have 60 cameras, and time, that can be day, it can be week. We can aggregate the data the way we can, or it can be minutes, because camera traps work all day. And what we have here, we have, and be careful, because now I'm going to say one lie, and you have to detect my lie, okay? So what we have, this kind of matrices that says, okay, camera 1, time 1, a picture of, let's say, roe deer. Imagine that this is the table for roe deer. At time 1, it captures a roe deer. In time 3, no roe deer, etc., etc. So we have this matrix. At time 2, that's a mistake. It's time n, whatever, right? And for the 60 cameras, we have this table. And so what it says here, for this period of time, we can say that in camera 1, the species X, which can be the roe deer, has been present 75% of the times, right? 3 out of 4 times. Yes or no? Well, I told I would lie, so it's a no. So where's the lie here? Where am I wrong? No, well, no, but I have, but so is this sentence true? That for this period of time, species X has been present in 3 out of 4 times. Is this true or not? It's a subtle difference, but the sentence is wrong because it's not been present, it's been seen, it's been captured, it has taken a picture, right? So this 0 can be true or can be false, because maybe if time 3 is midday, let's say, and where the camera focuses is super sunny or hot, maybe the species goes behind the camera because it's too hot there, or for whichever reason, right? So this is what you call a false 0, but it can be true. But we don't know. We don't know if it's a real 0 or a false 0, right? So how do we solve this? Because we cannot go back. We have this huge, because it's huge, yeah? We have each year, we have like, we have around 70,000 pictures. And well, if you've worked with camera traps, we know that most of the pictures are of nothing, or a leaf moving like this, and that triggers the camera. But around 6,000 pictures of animals each year, right? And we cannot go back. We don't know whether this 0 means that the species was not there, or just that the species was not pictured, but the species was going behind or whatever. So the way we solve it is what we use. Of course, we always use statistical methods, tricks. We use the statistics, but basically we lose a little, and we use what we call hierarchical models, conditional models, and basically we lose a little bit of resolution, but we say, imagine that now we merge these 4 times. Imagine that this is week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4, right? So we don't work at the weekly resolution, and we say we work at the monthly resolution that has 4 weeks, right? So we say, okay, this species was present that month in camera 1, but with a given probability of capture. And the probability of detection, not capture, detection, which is called detectability, is 75%, right? And so we change presence absence, 0, 1. We modulate the 0, 1 by the probability of detection, right? This is what we call conditional models. So we say it's present, but the detectability was this one. And then we work with probabilities of presence, right? We change the 0, 1s by probability of occupancy, which is this state, 0, 1, let's say modulated by the condition of detecting it. And these models are, again, quite, let's say, tricky because, for example, as with the trees, we use different factors to explain either the presence absence or the detectability. And let's say, for example, and a given factor can be used in different ways in affecting the presence or the detection. For example, if the species is, let's say, a roe deer, which is a forest species, if the camera is in a forest, it positively affects the presence because it's a forest species. So if the camera is in a forest, it has a positive effect. But if it's in a forest, maybe it has a negative effect on the detectability because maybe there's a tree and the deer, and we cannot detect the deer every time the deer goes in front of the camera because there's a tree in between. So forest, or let's say density of forest, positively affects the occupancy or the presence absence, but negatively affects the probability of detection, right? So these models are a bit complicated, but if you have the data and you like statistics and you like coding and R and this kind of stuff, so then it's fun. It's very complicated, but it's fun. So this is the way we treat this data. It's complicated, but I mean, it's great because I mean, it's nice that you have there 24 hours a day, right? Working with camera traps. And then we have things like this. For example, I don't know if I'm speaking, I'm not controlling the time, but I just keep on, huh? You stop me. So we have, let's say for this, this is a test we did. This is only for 2 years, I think. If I remember well, it's 2016 and 17. And for example, we have the occupancy that is now the probability of presence. Yeah, for 2 years of chamois, pine chamois. And here that we had for the 2 years a different seasons. So here we merge all the data for season, and we have two different behaviors of the same species in the same place, right, in the Pyrenees. But this is the kind of data we can use, or we can work with that. This is quite more recent. This is the results of a master thesis that the student just finished last year. We can work with daily activity patterns. For example, this is data aggregated for 6 years from 0 to, so this is all the day, right? So we have the temporal patterns and the overlap between species. Here we have chamois and roe deer, and you see that, well, chamois is a bit more diurnal than roe deer. For example, here you have wild boar in black, wild boar and chamois, and see wild boar is most active early in the morning and late in the night compared to chamois, and roe deer and wild boar follow, let's say, similar patterns, right? Like this bimodal. So we can play with this kind of data with the camera traps. We can also see changes for a given species, changes between seasons. For example, here you see that this is for chamois. There's not much change, a little bit maybe more active during the day in spring. And for wild boar, there's no change among seasons, between seasons, in the daily activity patterns. Or something that we can also do is compare sites, because we have these 12 sites. And we can classify them whether they are more high, they have higher presence of humans, because our site, I mean, I didn't mention that, but these 12 sites, there's a natural park, there's a ski resort, there's places that are far, etc. So for example, for chamois, we see that in the remote places, so places where there's almost no presence of humans, they are more diurnal. Whereas in places where there's a lot of people, during the day, they don't move much. And they prefer to move early in the morning and then in the night. So they avoid the contact with humans. And for roe deer, you see that there's not much change between remote places and places where there's a little bit of presence of humans. Probably this is because since roe deer is more species in the forest, they can easily hide from people and they don't need to change much their behavior. Also, there's some biological explanation, because roe deer have a small stomach and they cannot be like many hours without eating. So they have to move, they have to eat, right? Whereas, for example, chamois can stay out of the human presence and just escape, because it can be longer without eating. It's not the case of roe deer. For biodiversity, we have used, and we're going to talk about this a little tomorrow, different methodological, with different traps. These are called interception traps. These are called attraction traps, and we're going to, can talk about this tomorrow. And also, this is the Malay trap, which is very famous and very widely used. They intersect insects that move around, and then you capture the insects. And we have also used as a, let's say, as a natural trap, the feces of the birds that we capture. So when we capture the birds, we put them in bags, and they normally leave a present for us, which are the feces, and we collect the feces, and we put them in DNA, and then we analyze the DNA content of the feces, which basically is what they have eaten, right? And they eat insects. These birds eat insects mostly. So basically what we have found is that with these are the standard methods, and this is something that it's quite new. Actually, it has not been done much so far. We have the same number of species. We're writing a paper now on this, but the composition is very different. So maybe, I don't remember, we have like 100 something species using the normal standard traps and 100 species also from the birds, but they're absolutely different species. Well, some are the same, but using these natural traps, the birds, we have almost doubled the list of species that we have in the Pyrenees, and of course, we also have seasonal changes, elevational changes, etc., etc. Well, this is now used more and more because DNA analysis is cheaper. It's still a bit expensive, but it's cheaper and cheaper. So it's something that probably is going to be used widely in the future. But this is quite interesting because actually we weren't expecting this data. Well, this result also because these traps capture insects that move and fly around, and birds mostly eat the insects that are in the branches, and maybe some of them do not fly. So that's why we have increased a lot the list of species that they are there that we wouldn't have captured with the normal methods. So that's it for this. And let me go back to this. You probably remember this. And we have been working, well, I have a PhD student and had a master's student last year that we worked in this scenario. And we wanted to apply this, this way of using or of understanding the mountains and trying to not only formalize or conceptualize these interactions, saying, well, there's the managers that use the trees or whatever, but put numbers on this and to see if we could really formalize and quantify some of these interactions. So what we did, so this is Catalonia here. The Pyrenees are here. So the Pyrenees are more or less here. So we took 2 counties where there's an important river, and we tried to gather as many data or that could explain the water that is flowing in this river, right? Our resource was water availability, let's say, and we wanted to see, given, so the resource water, which was the interaction of everything related to this, to the water availability, right? So basically what we did, so well, the area, these 2 counties are, let's say, a typical mountain area. There's quite a lot of agriculture. There's abandoned towns. There's some important cities, well, bigger than Edolo and smaller than Milan, let's say. And we have a couple of ski resorts. So it's a quite diverse and typical mountain area with a little bit of everything. And so what did we do? So we took data from the last 20 years at the monthly resolution of as many things as we could for some things. And we could, of course, we took hydrological data, but also climatic data from remote sensing, and also socioeconomical data from the Statistical Institute of Catalonia. Of course, there's some, always that you work with databases, etc. There's always missing values. There's some data that we didn't have the monthly resolution, so we had to infer it or calculate or impute this, or in some cases average them and use different proxies, because what you normally do is, okay, you say, let's say you use, I think it's here. Let's say I want to use temperature. Okay, but temperature, which is so this is the element, but which is the variable you use for temperature? The maximum, the minimum, the average, or you say, I don't know, how many tourists? But tourism, how do you quantify tourism? So you can say, okay, I will use as a proxy the number of people staying at the hotel or the number of people that go to ski. So you have to decide for each of the variables which are the indicators that you will use. So we gathered around, I think, remember, around 200 indicators at the monthly resolution. And we hypothesized the relation, all the relation among them. For example, I don't know if it's gonna work. Yeah. So for example, I don't know why I marked this, but for example, this have the independent variable and here the dependent variable. So here, for example, we hypothesize, okay, precipitation has a positive effect on flow, has a positive effect on the volume of water, has a positive effect on evapotranspiration, so the higher the precipitation, the higher the evapotranspiration, and has a negative effect on snow cover, for example. And snow cover has a positive effect on seasonal population, because the more it snows, the more skiers you have. So you have to hypothesize the relationship between all these variables. And then, see if it works. Yeah, you build models. You draw the models like this, and you perform, so the statistical approach is called path analysis. And it's different than the linear models that we normally use, because you can have these variables that are in the middle. So you can say, okay, variable x1 affects this one, but through this one, right? So you can just draw your interaction. Of course, it has to be based on hypothesis. And for example, you could say, okay, total population has an effect on the concessions on supply of water, which will affect the volume, right? Whether positively or negatively. Or snow cover will affect the volume, i.e. the flow, and precipitation, of course, will have an effect on the flow, which at the same time will have an effect on the volume, right? This could be a model. Models can be simpler, can be more complicated, et cetera, et cetera. And then what you do is build models. So with all our hundreds of data at the monthly resolution, we built that these are 9, but we have, I think, if I remember well, 16 models that work. That say, for example, things like this. So for the last model, the one that I just showed, we see that, okay, and you can figure out the positive and the negative effects. In the model, you say it has an effect, and then the model tells you whether it's positive or negative. So for example, we see that total population has a positive effect on supply concessions. So the higher the population, the higher the concessions for supply, for water for supply, right? The higher the supply concessions, the lower the volume, because there's more water taken from the river or from the wherever, which of course has a negative volume. And here, so the higher the snow cover, remember that we have seasonal data, the lower the flow, probably because it's released from the snow, it's released slowly to the stream. And the higher the precipitation, the higher the flow, which makes sense. And the higher the flow, the higher the volume. Right? So this is a kind of, so this is how how this analysis shows you, well, it doesn't show it like nice like this, eh? It gives you a table and then you have to make it nice, but we have this table. And finally, what we do is put the different models together, which is something that you can do. And here you have all the interactions. Actually, now we have many more, but I couldn't put it. But here you have all the 16, well, here is 10 models. Now we have 16, but you have all the, let's say, network of interactions between all or among most of the elements of this socio-ecological system that we have been able to build. And actually, for example, you can see that forests has a positive effect on rural tourism, probably because there's people visiting the forest, whatever, and then we have to explore this. We see, for example, that, I don't know, secondary residences have a negative effect on the total GDP, or livestock has a positive effect on the presence of the quantity of mares and bushes, et cetera, right? So now we have this with numbers, and now we have this. That's what we have now. Our next steps is making it possible to play with this, because this is based on relationships that finally are relations one-to-one. So imagine that now, since now I have the relation, which is, let's say, it's quite strong, of temperature and snow cover. Now I can put there in temperature the future scenarios. And then there will be direct effects and indirect effects that have cascading effects on all this, which we don't know what's going to happen, right? So our next step is having a tool, which we know more or less how to do it, to be able to put scenarios or to say, okay, what happens if I invest as a decision maker, if I invest in rural tourism, what will happen to all these components? We will have direct, indirect, expected, and unexpected results. And we think that this is a very interesting approach because, for example, here we have biodiversity, and here we have biodiversity, but see that biodiversity, we have added quite more data of biodiversity now, right? We really can have a tool that puts together not only plants and animals, but the social ecological system in which they are living now. That, of course, it's very, so you can have British species, but if there's lots of people going there, you won't have species, okay? So I think that's, or you can invest in agriculture, for example. What happens, so we see something interesting that agriculture has a negative effect on GDP, so, which is strange, but actually it makes sense somehow because now, at least there, what gives more money is still tourism and a little bit snow cover, but the snow cover increases the seasonal population a little bit, and the snow cover still has a positive effect, light, but on the total, on the GDP on services, which has a light but positive effect on the total GDP of the region, right? So this is a place where there's tourist ski resorts, but they will be struggling very soon because they are in the southern, they are the ones that will disappear probably the first because of the lack of snow. Or so, but still, I mean, here, let's say the economic status of the area still depends quite a lot on, or quite a lot on the tourism and the ski tourism, seasonal population, etc., etc. And that's all. I'm sorry if I spoke too much.
Very interesting. And are there any questions? Also for students connected with the platform, in Teams. Are there any questions? It's very, very interesting. At the end, I will communicate to you that Bernard is not only a researcher dealing with very fascinating topics, but is also the coordinator of NIMOR. NIMOR, it's a very important network for mountain research. We joined forces in order to establish this new network. New?
Yeah, 2017.
Okay, so yeah, we can consider it new. Yeah. It's composed by
35 European institutions, yeah.
Around all Europe, 15 countries, states.
I don't remember, yeah.
More or less.
Yeah, yeah. European, I mean, most of the countries that have mountains.
Yes, yes, and this network promotes research for sustainable development of mountain areas at the European level, of course. And considering the last slide you show, it's very important to join forces also to interact with the public institutions taking decisions on how to manage these fragile ecosystems. And so,
so if you, I mean, if you have any questions, you can send by email questions to them and then to me, or I will share with you send the presentation to them. Well, it's here, so you can use it, no problem.
There is a question in the chat. Since you have taken samples of fat tissue, did you measure lipophilic contaminants?
Yeah, no, Patricia, I mean, the fat is not sampled from the bird. We've released the bird. And so it's a method that bird ringers use. And you put the bird upside down and you blow it, and then you see the fat through the skin. And if it's yellowish, so depending on how much yellow it has, there's more fat content or less. So we don't take the samples of. Yeah. It's the fat content that's stored here in the belt. Yeah.
There is another consideration, very interesting. Less man occupation, great difference in altitude.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting, especially last model and its evolution.
Thank you. We are very excited of this last model.
Yes. And it's quite new. It's very interesting also to verify the complexity of studying the ecosystems in the fields and in sampling data.
It's very difficult. Yeah. It takes time, but it's fun. Well, it's hard.
Okay. Okay, so we can stop and finish, and let's see tomorrow for whom will come to the field visit, lasting all the day, starting at, I don't remember, Stefano, Luca.
8:30 tomorrow.
Okay, at 8:30 here, and see you for the next seminar on Thursday at the same time. Okay, perfect. Bye. Ciao. Ciao a tutti.